I paused the bank card at 62, not 7 months later, and looking back, that is where the whole thing might have started ending. I held the box out to her without looking at her face. A small velvet case, the kind that comes from a counter with good lighting, and inside it, a fountain pen. Sterling silver, her initials engraved on the clip. $41 at an estate sale in Media, Pennsylvania. I'd polished it myself the night before at the kitchen table, careful with the cloth, thinking about how she used to write me letters when I was still driving a delivery route and she was finishing her nursing degree at night. She opened it in the middle of the Rotary Club banquet hall, in front of 80 people who had known us for 3 decades, and I watched her face do something I will never forget. Not disappointment, something colder than that. She set the box down on the linen tablecloth like it had confirmed a decision she'd already made, and she reached under her chair for a shopping bag I hadn't noticed. Inside it was a matte black golf bag, top of the line, the kind that runs close to $9,000, and stitched into the leather in gold thread were the initials R.K., not mine. Richard Kowalski's, our accountant. The man who'd done our taxes for 11 years, and who was sitting 2 tables away in a blazer I now understood she had picked out for him. "Everyone," she said, standing, raising her glass. "I want to thank Richard publicly for everything he's done for this community, and for me personally, this past year." The room applauded. Richard stood, flushed, and walked over to accept the bag like it was the most natural thing in the world, like his wife of 30 years, Deborah, wasn't sitting 6 feet away with her hand frozen around her wine glass. I looked down at the pen in my hands. $41. Hers, my wife of 38 years, Carol Ann Whitfield, had just spent $9,000 in front of our entire town on a man she'd been having an affair with, and handed me a used fountain pen like an afterthought she'd remembered on the drive over. She leaned down as she sat back in her chair, close enough that her voice was only for me. "You never wanted anything anyway, Walter. I figured practical was safest." I looked at her. I searched her face for something. Guilt, embarrassment, even cruelty would have been easier to sit with. What I found instead was relief, like a woman setting down a bag she'd been carrying too long. I smiled at her. I told her thank you, that it was thoughtful. I am 62 years old, and I have spent most of my life being the calm one, the one who doesn't make scenes, and that instinct did not leave me even then, even with my chest caving in like a struck bell. My name is Walter Ambrose. I live in a town outside Scranton, Pennsylvania, small enough that everyone at that banquet had watched my children grow up. And before 6 o'clock the next morning, I was 3 states away. But before I left, I placed something on her nightstand, something she wouldn't find until she woke up alone, and when she found it, our neighbor told me later, you could hear her from the street. Stay with me, because what happened after that letter is not the part of this story anyone expected, including me. To understand what happened in that banquet hall, you have to understand who Carol Ann was before she became a woman who could do something like that to a man in front of his own town. Because she wasn't always like this. I need you to know that first, because it's the only way any of the rest of it makes sense, even to me. I met Carol Ann in 1986 at a wedding in Wilkes-Barre. She was a bridesmaid, laughing too loud at her own jokes, and I was the groom's cousin who'd had exactly enough courage from 2 beers to ask her to dance. She had a way of looking at you like you were the only interesting thing in the room, and for 30 years, I believe that was simply who she was, generous with her attention, warm by nature. We built a life the way people used to, slowly, on purpose. I drove trucks for a regional freight company for 26 years, then moved into dispatch management when my knees started complaining about the road. Carol Ann became a labor and delivery nurse at Geisinger, and later, when the hospital consolidated, she moved into hospital administration, budget committees, long meetings, longer hours. I was proud of that climb. I told everyone who'd listen. I picked up the slack at home without being asked, learned to cook more than eggs, learned which of our grandchildren's recitals mattered more to which of our children, kept the calendar in my head because Carol Ann's was always full of other people's emergencies. We raised 2 children, Michael and Renee, both grown now, both with families of their own 2 states away. We paid off the house in Clark's Summit in 2019. We built a life that looked, from any reasonable distance, like a success. Somewhere in the last 18 months, though, Carol Ann started changing in ways I noticed but didn't want to name. She started going to the gym at odd hours. She started taking calls in the garage with the door shut. She stopped commenting on the garden, which she used to love, tomatoes and dahlias, the one thing that was mine and hers together. A coolness set in that had no obvious cause, no fight, No incident I could point to, just a slow withdrawal, like watching a tide go out so gradually, you only notice the sand has changed when you're already standing somewhere you didn't mean to be. I told myself it was menopause. I told myself it was stress from the hospital merger. I told myself a great many things, because the alternative required a kind of looking I wasn't ready to do. The banquet was the Rotary Club's 40th anniversary dinner, the same one we'd attended every year since I joined in 1994. Carol Ann had been on the planning committee, which meant she'd spent months with Richard Kowalski discussing seating charts and vendor contracts, or so I'd believed. She arrived separately that night, said she needed to help set up, and by the time I got there, she was already deep in conversation with him near the dessert table, her hand resting on his forearm in a way that made something in my stomach go quiet and careful. Richard was 58, recently divorced adjacent, in that limbo where a man starts dressing better and joining a gym and telling everyone he's finally doing things for himself. He'd handled our taxes since Michael was in middle school. He knew our whole financial life. I had never once considered him a threat, which I understand now was its own kind of foolishness. A woman named Patrice, who ran the church's outreach committee, came over while I was standing near the bar, nursing a club soda. "Walter, I don't know how you keep up with her schedule these days," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. "You must be a saint." I gave her the answer I always gave. "You get used to it." She smiled at me the way you smile at someone at a funeral, gentle, careful, holding something back. I understand now that a great many people in that room already knew something I didn't, and had decided, out of some misguided kindness, that it wasn't their place to tell me. The gift exchange had been Carol Ann's idea that year, a thank you to our spouses segment tacked onto the anniversary program, which she'd never proposed before in 30 years of membership. I should have registered that as strange. I didn't, because by then I'd trained myself not to register much of anything that might require me to act on it. When she reached under her chair for that golf bag, I actually felt a flicker of pleasure, thinking for half a second, absurdly, that it might somehow be for me, that I'd misjudged the whole shape of the evening. Richard didn't even golf particularly well. I knew that because I'd played with him twice, years ago, at the club Carol Ann's hospital comped memberships for. "Everyone," she said, and her voice had a warmth in it I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to count. "I want to thank Richard publicly." The applause felt endless. Richard walked to her, with the easy confidence of a man who'd rehearsed this moment, who'd perhaps even suggested it. He hugged her a beat too long for an accountant receiving a professional courtesy gift. I watched Deborah Kowalski's face at the next table over, and I understood, in that single frozen second, that she and I were now bound together by something neither of us had asked for. Then Carol Ann turned to me. "Walter," she said, and reached back under her chair. The velvet box she pulled out was smaller, plainer, no ribbon. She held it out and waited, the way you'd wait for a child to open a present at a party that wasn't really about the child at all. I had to stand and take it from her hand in front of everyone I'd known for 30 years. I opened it. The fountain pen looked smaller than I remembered polishing it, catching the banquet hall light in a way that only made the gap between the two gifts more obvious. $9,000. 41. The silence that followed wasn't the silence of surprise. It was the silence of a room deciding, collectively and without discussion, where to look instead of at me. She leaned in close enough that only I could hear. "You never wanted anything anyway, Walter. I figured practical was safest." I looked at her face, and I looked for cruelty. Because cruelty I could have understood. Cruelty at least acknowledges you're a person worth hurting. What I found instead was something closer to boredom. Like she was already thinking about the drive home, already 3 steps past this moment and into whatever came next. "Thank you," I said. Very thoughtful, and I sat there, 62 years old, holding a $41 pen in a banquet hall, while every person who had watched my children grow up decided, one by one, to look at their plates. If you have ever stood in a room and felt someone look through you, rather than at you, not with hatred but with something closer to indifference, you already know something that doesn't translate well into words. Hatred means you still register as a person worth the feeling. Indifference means you've become furniture, something to be managed around, not considered. I have thought about that distinction more in the months since than I ever expected to think about anything. The drive home was quiet. Carol Ann stared out the window, already composing herself into whoever she'd need to be by Monday. I drove the familiar roads. past the elementary school where Michael had broken his arm on the monkey bars, past the church where we'd buried both my parents, and I thought about the year I'd taken the overnight dispatch shifts so she could finish her administrative certification without worrying about money. I thought about the anniversary trip to the Poconos we'd canceled 3 years running because her budget cycle never allowed it. I thought about the garden gate I'd fixed twice that spring that she'd walked past both times without a word. We got home. She went upstairs to her study, the room she'd taken over when Renee moved out, the one with a lock on the door I'd never once questioned. I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. At 1:20 in the morning, her phone buzzed on the counter where she'd left it charging, face down, which she never did. She always kept it face up, she'd told me once, in case one of the kids needed her. Tonight it was face down, and it buzzed again, and then a third time. I picked it up. Richard. Tonight was perfect. Deborah suspects something. We need to be careful for a few weeks. I can't keep pretending I don't want this to be permanent. Permanent. I set the phone down exactly where I'd found it, face down, and I sat with that word for a long time in the dark kitchen. I did not feel rage, not yet. I felt something quieter and heavier settle into my chest, a grief that understood, before the rest of me caught up, that something had already ended and I was only now being told about it. I did not sleep. Around 3, I went down to the basement, to the workbench in the corner. Carol Ann called my hideout, said with the same tolerant amusement she used for anything she considered beneath serious attention. That amusement, it turned out, had been a gift, because she had never once looked carefully at what I kept down there. Behind a tackle box and a stack of old dispatch logs was a folder I'd started keeping 8 months earlier, not because I'd suspected this exact betrayal, but because something in me had been quietly cataloging a pattern before I was willing to name it out loud. Credit card statements showing charges at a boutique hotel off Route 6, 11 times in 6 months, always on nights she'd told me she was at budget retreats. A jewelry receipt from a store in Scranton for a bracelet I'd never seen her wear. Withdrawals from an account I hadn't known existed, $42,000 over the past year, funneled out in amounts small enough, she must have believed, not to draw my attention. I had explained every one of these away to myself for months. Client dinners, conference fees, the ordinary financial fog of a demanding job. Looking at it all together now, laid out on the workbench under a single bare bulb, there was no explaining left to do. I photographed every page. I put the folder back exactly as I'd found it. Then I climbed the stairs to the small home office that had once been Michael's bedroom, and I pulled a sheet of the good stationery Carol Ann kept for Christmas cards she rarely wrote anymore, and I wrote for almost an hour. By 5:30, my truck was loaded. I took my father's old hunting rifle, the one thing of his I'd never let her talk me into selling. I took the external drive with 40 years of family photographs I'd digitized myself over a decade of Sunday afternoons. I took my late mother's rosary and my tools and the folder from the basement. I left behind the house, the furniture we'd chosen together, every gift she'd ever given me that came, I now understood, with an invisible string attached. I placed the sealed letter on her nightstand, on top of the phone she'd need for her morning alarm, and I walked out into the cold Pennsylvania dark to my truck. The letter told her everything, that I knew about Richard, about the hotel off Route 6, about the account she thought I'd never find. That I'd spoken with a lawyer twice over the past 4 months, and that lawyer had already begun drafting papers. That there was a savings account of my own, built quietly from 20 years of overtime pay she'd never bothered to track, holding $168,000. That the house, refinanced 2 years ago while she was at a hospital conference in Baltimore, had a clause in it she'd signed without reading closely, one that protected far more of my equity than she likely remembered agreeing to. Was that clause entirely fair to her? I've turned that question over more times than I can count, and I still land somewhere I'm at peace with. I had spent 38 years learning that gentleness alone doesn't protect you from someone who has decided you no longer require protecting. So somewhere in the last year, without quite admitting it to myself, I had stopped being unprotected. The letter ended simply, "You spent this year deciding how to leave me. I spent this year understanding you already had. I hope somewhere down the road you remember that I was never as blind as you needed me to be." I signed it Walter, and I drove west into a sky that hadn't started lightening yet. I have to be honest about those first hours on the interstate because I think they matter. I did not feel triumphant. I felt an ache that went all the way down, the particular grief of losing something that had already been gone for longer than I'd let myself admit. What I was driving away from wasn't a bad marriage, exactly. It was the version of Carol Ann I had spent 38 years believing was the whole truth. The woman who used to write me letters when I drove nights, who cried when Michael left for basic training, who kept every ticket stub from every movie we'd ever seen in a coffee can in the garage. That woman had been real once. I grieved her the whole way through Ohio. I turned my phone back on somewhere past Youngstown. 61 missed calls, 48 texts. The progression of her messages read like a case study. Denial first, then confusion, then somewhere around the 40th message, something that finally sounded like fear. 7:15 a.m. Walter, whatever you think you saw, you're misunderstanding it. Call me. 8:40 a.m. I went into the account. Where did this money come from? We need to talk about this like adults. 10:05 a.m. Something's happening at the hospital. HR called me in. Please call me back. I set the phone in the cup holder and kept driving. I want to be honest with you about what happened next, because I know people will ask whether it was cruel. I've sat with that question for months now, turning it over on quiet evenings, and here's the truest answer I've got. I made one phone call, and I sent one photograph, and everything that followed was already loaded, already leaning, and all I did was let it fall the direction it was already falling. The photograph showed Carol Ann and Richard walking into that hotel off Route 6, time-stamped, dated. I sent it not to Carol Ann, but to Deborah Kowalski. Deborah called me the next afternoon. Her voice was steadier than I expected. Walter, she said, I think you and I need to sit down. I met her at a diner outside Dunmore 2 days later, expecting someone shattered. Instead, I found a woman who reminded me, uncomfortably, of myself 6 months earlier, someone who had been quietly cataloging a pattern of her own and had simply been waiting for enough proof to act on it. She had a folder of her own on the table before I'd even sat down. Tell me what you know, she said. No preamble. What she showed me changed the shape of everything I thought I understood. Richard had been transferring money out of their joint investment account into a separate one for over a year, nearly $60,000. Almost exactly what that golf bag and a string of dinners and hotel stays would have added up to. Deborah had already filed for divorce that morning, and she'd already contacted the state board that licensed Richard's CPA credentials, because 2 of his other longtime clients, it turned out, had noticed irregularities in their filings that Deborah suspected weren't accidents. She'll distance herself from him fast, I told Deborah. That's how Carol Ann operates. When someone becomes a liability, she cuts the rope. Deborah looked at me without blinking. That's exactly what I'm counting on. The divorce filing reached Richard at his office on a Thursday morning, hand-delivered. The same morning, the state accountancy board's preliminary inquiry letter arrived about the irregularities in his other clients' filings. Word moves fast in a town our size. By that afternoon, the hospital's finance office had questions of its own, because Carol Ann, as it turned out, had used Richard for more than personal tax advice. He'd helped her restructure a departmental budget line 2 years running, and once people started looking closely, the restructuring didn't look like an accountant helping a friend. It looked like a pattern. Carol Ann did exactly what I predicted she'd do. She distanced herself immediately, told the hospital's compliance office she'd trusted Richard's professional judgment and had no personal relationship with him beyond the standard client courtesy of a longtime accountant. That story might have held if Deborah hadn't already given her own attorney the hotel timestamps, the credit card statements, 11 matching nights over 6 months that lined up exactly with Carol Ann's supposed budget retreats. 3 weeks after the banquet, Carol Ann was placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. 6 weeks after that, she resigned rather than be terminated, and the hospital, wanting the whole thing quietly gone, let her walk with a modest severance and a signed agreement that kept the details out of any public record. I heard all of this from Deborah, who called me every few weeks that spring, not out of any particular closeness, but because we'd become, without either of us choosing it, witnesses to the same unraveling. When she told me Carol Ann was gone from the hospital entirely, I expected to feel something like satisfaction. What I felt instead was a tired kind of sadness, grief for the shape of a life I'd spent 38 years building that had turned out to be standing on ground. Neither of us had really understood. Richard's accountancy license was suspended pending the board's full investigation, and 2 months later, formally revoked. He'd have to start over in some other field entirely, in his late 50s, with a client list of nobody and a name that wouldn't survive a basic search in this town for years. Deborah kept the house. Her attorney told her the timeline Richard was looking at: restitution to at least 3 former clients, likely no criminal charges if he cooperated, but no way back into the only profession he'd ever known. I was 6 months into a small life outside Bozeman, Montana, working part-time for a regional trucking outfit that appreciated a dispatcher who actually understood the roads, when Carol Ann's rental car pulled into the gravel lot outside my cabin on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. She got out slowly. Jeans, flat shoes, hair pulled back plain, none of the polish I'd spent 38 years watching her assemble every morning. She looked like someone still learning to stand without the scaffolding she'd built her whole adult life around. "Hello, Walter. How'd you find me?" "Michael. He wouldn't give me the address. He gave your lawyer a message that you might be willing to talk." I set down the fence post I'd been driving and gestured toward the 2 chairs on the porch. She sat carefully, the way people sit in places they know aren't quite theirs to sit in. She told me about the leave, the resignation, the severance that had already mostly gone to a lawyer, and a security deposit on a 1-bedroom apartment in Clark's Summit, 3 miles from the house we used to share, which was now in the middle of being sold to cover what remained of the equity split. She told me she'd spent the first month telling anyone who'd listened that Richard had misled her, that she was another one of his victims. I looked at her steadily. Was that true? A long pause. No. She looked down at her hands. I knew about the transfers. I told him where the soft spots were in the budget review, which line items nobody double-checked. And when it all came apart, I let people believe I'd been fooled, because I didn't know how else to survive what I'd actually done. She exhaled slowly. I let Deborah's lawyer paint him as the only villain in the room for as long as I could get away with it. And then I sat in my car, outside the unemployment office for 40 minutes, because I couldn't decide which part of myself disgusted me more. The wind moved through the pines at the edge of the property. Somewhere down the ridge, a dog barked twice and went quiet. "Why, Carol Ann?" I asked, not with accusation, with something closer to a genuine need to finally understand. 38 years. Why wasn't it enough? She was quiet a long time. "Because I stopped seeing you," she finally said. "Not all at once. I just slowly stopped noticing whether you were all right because you never needed me to notice. You handled everything. You never fell apart, never asked for anything, never made yourself hard to manage. And Richard." She stopped, her voice going flat. "Richard needed things, wanted things out loud. He looked at me like I was the most important decision he'd make that day, every day. It felt like being seen, for a while." She laughed, a small, humorless sound. What he actually wanted was access to 2 hospital budget lines and a client list I could hand him. But I couldn't see that clearly, because I was too busy feeling important. "You mistook being needed for being loved," I said. "Yes." Her voice was barely above the wind. "That's exactly what I did." We sat there a while without talking. I didn't reach for her hand. I didn't perform forgiveness. I didn't feel. But I also didn't perform my own pain for her benefit, and I think she understood both of those choices for what they were. "The house sells at the end of the month," she said eventually. "After the lawyers, there won't be much left over. I'm going to have to start over from close to nothing." She looked at me, something unguarded finally surfacing in her face. "What about you? What will you do?" "I already am doing it," I said, something smaller, something honest. She stood, smoothing her jeans. "I'm not going to fight the settlement. Whatever the lawyers worked out, I'll sign it. I don't need anything else from you," I told her. "I just need it to be over." She nodded, and then, for just a moment, the composure she'd rebuilt over 6 months cracked open. "You deserved someone who kept looking at you," she said. "I stopped looking, Walter. I am more sorry than I know how to say to you." After her tail lights disappeared down the gravel road, I sat on that porch until the mountains went from gold to gray to nearly black. This is what I want you to hear clearly, because I think it matters more than anything else in this story. I did not feel like I'd won something. I felt something steadier than winning. I felt finished. The grief that had been sitting in my chest since that banquet hall had finally done what grief does when you stop running from it. It cleared the ground. Here's what I know now, at 62, that I wish someone had told me at 30. The mistake most of us make is waiting patiently for someone to finally notice us, believing that enough quiet loyalty will eventually be seen and rewarded. It won't. You cannot outweight someone else's blindness. When a person has decided, even quietly, even without saying it out loud, that you don't require their attention anymore. The only honest thing left to do is remove yourself from their calculations entirely and let them work out what they've actually lost. I have a small house now outside Bozeman, nothing fancy, a wood stove, and a good view of the Bridgers in the morning. I have a garden with tomatoes that actually get admired, because my neighbor Frank stops by most evenings to see how they're coming along. I've made friends in this town who know me as Walter, not as the man married to the hospital administrator everyone in Clark's Summit used to talk about. I sit on that porch most evenings with a cup of coffee, and the particular quiet of a man who has nothing left to prove to anybody. I'm 62 years old, and I have never been more certain of what I'm actually worth. Before I let you go tonight, I want to ask you something, and I'd genuinely like to know. If you think I was right to leave that letter and drive off without a word, without giving her the satisfaction of a scene, tell me you're with me on that. If you think I should have confronted her right there at that banquet table, made her say it to my face in front of everyone the way she'd humiliated me in front of everyone, tell me that instead. And if you think I waited too long, that the signs were sitting in plain view for a year before I finally opened that folder, I want to hear that too, because some nights I think you might be right. And tell me, if you would, where you're listening from tonight, what town, what state, what time it is, where you're sitting right now. I read every one of those, and every single one means something to me. Have you ever given someone 30 years of showing up, certain that consistency would eventually be its own kind of love language, and woken up one day unable to remember the last time anyone asked whether you were doing all right? If that's you, if any piece of what I've told you tonight lives somewhere in what you're quietly carrying, I want you to know you are not invisible. Not to me, not tonight. Leave a word down below, even just one, so I know you're out there. And if this story found something in you tonight, if it put words to something you've been sitting with quietly for a while, stay close. There are more stories coming, the honest kind, the kind that sit with you a little after the screen goes dark.